Located off the coast of mainland China lies the island nation of Taiwan, one that has garnered far more attention as of late. Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China, as opposed to the People's Republic of China, which is on the mainland, is quite possibly the country most resembling a sovereign nation state, which isn't oftentimes recognized as a sovereign nation state by the international community. This island, in many ways, will arguably be the most important geopolitical theater of this century, arguably even more important than Ukraine or the Middle East. As we transition further away from a world built on oil and gas to one based off of silicon and ingenuity. The island, that did not play a significant role in history up until, say, 100 years ago, will be a focal flashpoint for the next several decades, if not a century or two. Today, the two most powerful nations on the planet are the United States, an open, pluralistic, liberal democracy with some challenges here and there, and on the other hand, on the other side of the ring, the People's Republic of China, an authoritarian one-party state with an economic system that mixes capitalism and socialism in a way that doesn't really quite fit into any sort of ism. There are plenty of disagreements between these two nations and their respected allies over military interventions, intellectual property, currency manipulation, human rights, trade policy, etc. But the issue of Taiwan is at the forefront. None of this, by the way, is an attempt to get rid of any Taiwanese influence. After all, they are the central players of their own story, not the Americans, nor the mainland Chinese, or anyone else for that matter. The island nation of Taiwan, as stated before, lies off the coast of East Asia, residing in the subtropics and tropics, with the East China Sea to the north, the Philippine Sea separating the Philippines to the south, and the aptly named Taiwan Strait separating them from mainland China. To the southeast lies the South China Sea, a contentious area where the People's Republic of China is building man-made islands in order to expand their exclusive economic zones, much to the disdain of not only Taiwan, but the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Along with the strait between China lies a series of tiny islands, some of which are uninhabited and others do indeed have permanent settlements, making up roughly 100,000 people in total. The most well-known archipelago is the Penghu archipelago, which I'm mispronouncing. If an armed conflict does break out between these two Chinas, these series of islands would be some of the staging grounds. The mainland on the island has flat western coasts, where most of the population lives, including the city of Taipei, which is the nation's capital and center of not only politics, but also business, science, technology, art, and culture. Despite not being part of a widely recognized nation, it is, in spite of this all, shockingly enough, one of the most globally interconnected cities on the planet, and one of the most globally interconnected countries on the planet. The eastern two-thirds of the island are, by and large, very mountainous, though, covered in thick tropical rainforests rich in wildlife. The island, like many of the islands in this region, is also subject to typhoons, and there are also large fault lines across the western shores. The native inhabitants of the island are not Han Chinese, who migrated to the island later, but rather Austronesian Taiwanese people, known as the Formosan people, who currently make up less than 3% of the population. These people groups would eventually use the islands as staging points for settlements across much of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and even Madagascar and the Indian Ocean. Han Chinese people, while in contact with the people of these islands during the High Middle Ages, only started to settle en masse during the 1500s. As unusual as it sounds, this makes Taiwan's history somewhat similar to the Americas and Australia, a settler colonial state in which outsiders eventually settled and oftentimes stole land from the native inhabitants. Given that Taiwan is a democracy today, it is having some of the same conversations or similar conversations about indigenous rights and the mistreatment of indigenous people that have been going on in countries like Canada and Australia. This is in sharp contrast to the other China, which is rather hush-hush about its own treatment of minority groups. Speaking of colonization, the Portuguese would explore the island on their way to Japan. Then the Dutch and Spanish arrived and built settlements as well. Eventually, European forces were driven off by the mainland Chinese. It eventually became part of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty before the entire Chinese dynastic system started to collapse. This centuries-old system collapsed at the hands of the nationalists, who took control of the country. As you can tell, the written history and prominence of the island is pretty young, especially when compared to the ancient history of mainland China, one of the oldest civilizations. Eventually, the island would fall into Japanese hands, and would be set up in a similar fashion as many European colonies, but under Japanese rule. The islands were later used as a staging ground for Japanese attacks during the Second Sino-Japanese War, also known as the Mainland Asian Theater of World War II. After the Japanese were defeated by a combination of nationalists, who were sort of running the show, alongside communists who had fought together against the brutal foreign invasion, the communists and nationalists had their own civil war, in which the nationalists were backed up by the United States and the communists were backed up by the Soviet Union, right as the Cold War was beginning to unfold. The nationalists were led by Chiang Kai-shek, who eventually fled to Taiwan after being defeated by Mao on the mainland. Mao eventually became the official leader of the Communist Chinese Party. And this is where the true modern story begins. Chiang Kai-shek was a corrupt autocrat who set up martial law on Taiwan, but nonetheless was backed by the US since he was both against the Axis powers during World War II and anti-communist during the Cold War. Taiwan eventually lost its permanent place on the UN Security Council to the People's Republic of China at the UN, and due to ongoing pressure from the mainland, most nations, including the US, stopped formal recognition of Taiwan. It wasn't all bad, though. By the 1980s, some reforms took place, and a wave of democracy had swept through many parts of the world, such as Europe, Latin America, and East Asia. Keep in mind that mainland China was not swept under this wave, and crushed democracy protests, most notably in Tiananmen Square. Taiwan took a different path, becoming a democracy and rapidly industrializing and becoming a tech powerhouse during the 90s. To this day, each nation claims to be the one true China, and given that the mainland of China is far more powerful, an ongoing threat and invasion annexation of the mainland against Taiwan seems to be maybe not likely, but at the very least a very serious threat. For this reason, or more accurately for the sake of protecting themselves and staying close to their ally the US, the Taiwanese, instead of competing with the US when it came to research and development of technology, decided to create very advanced integrated sectors of the manufacturing of semiconductors rather than the design. Given that we live in a digital age, this has become a significant issue. I would summarize the mainland interest of China over Taiwan down to 5 core parts. First is that the People's Republic of China simply wants more territory, and more accurately, more maritime areas, with more resources and people. After all, bigger sometimes means better. This is a surface level view though, and speaking of the surface, one must go to the second cause, oceans. Given that China is heavily dependent on maritime trade, they would like to take control of the island chains that straddle their side of the Pacific. They've already built man-made islands to expand their waters, angering Filipinos, Vietnamese, and Malaysians, all of whom have become more sympathetic to Taiwan as time has gone by. Mainland China is building up a blue water navy that should be able to cruise off the continental shelf just like the American or British ones. But the problem is that Taiwan is a US ally, and this causes certain strategic concerns for the Chinese. And when I say the Chinese, I mean the People's Republic of China, the mainland. The third reason is that Taiwan is a tech powerhouse, developing semiconductors, and it's a critical part of the global economy, producing the foundations of the digital age. Given China's tech rivalry with the West, it fears Taiwan. Taiwan has also placed sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. Because of this, China's ally Russia will probably fall well behind in terms of technology in the coming decades. And the Chinese fear this too, as oftentimes their technological capabilities, while fairly impressive, are not quite on par with those of the developed world. This nonetheless has scared the US, and many of its allies, as the US and Germany have begun to develop their own semiconductor manufacturing systems in response to the Chinese threat of Taiwan. The fourth reason is political, as both nations claim to be the one true China, and the existence of one is sort of a threat to another, and this unsolved business has yet to be set in stone since the 1940s. It still needs to be accounted for, and over the past few decades, it's just been kicking a can down the road. The fifth reason is ideological. Taiwan and the mainland are both Han Chinese nations with deep historical, cultural, and ethnic roots. However, Taiwan is an open, liberal democracy, but the mainland is a one-party authoritarian state. Despite its weight on the world stage and massive economic growth, mainland China is still on average poorer than Taiwan, pound for pound, and it's not quite as impressive when it comes to a standard of living, social cohesion, human rights, GDP per capita, innovation, education, etc. The Chinese Communist Party sees this as a threat, as many in mainland China could seek a better life and a better set of standards of living under a different system, leading to more domestic hostility towards the Chinese Communist Party. This is, after all, how communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, as Eastern Europeans saw a higher standard of living in Western Europe. For these reasons, Taiwan has built up a relatively large military of 200,000, albeit far, far smaller than the mainland Chinese army, which is far bigger for obvious reasons. Due to this numerical disadvantage, Taiwan focuses on quality. Their country also has conscription for all able-bodied men. So, if the conventional military cannot handle the pressure, they can call in reserves and balloon the number of soldiers they can put in boots. Also, keep in mind that they're very well trained and very well equipped. And this is also a densely populated island. On top of that, amphibious and urban warfare are their specialty, and they are extremely difficult modes of fighting for the aggressor. With a wealthy economy and a lot of innovation, the mainland should think twice about an invasion, as quantity alone may not be powerful enough. On top of that, there's a possibility of bringing the United States and its allies into the war to defend Taiwan. However, the US response to Taiwan being threatened by the mainland is currently one of strategic ambiguity. It is waffled around. The US doesn't really give a clear answer as to whether or not it will defend Taiwan. And this is purposely there to confuse mainland China. A US-China war would probably be an economic disaster on a global scale, given how important their partnership is. It would probably be worse for China, though, as they rely on exports through seaports, whereas the US is more self-resilient. Even though the US controls the high seas with a very powerful navy, not to mention that US allies like Japan and Australia are other rich democratic nations which have very powerful navies as well, the Chinese still are a force to be reckoned with. Nonetheless, Australia, for example, has nuclear-powered submarines, which could choke off Chinese shipping routes to the Indian Ocean, while the US and Japan could choke off the Chinese exports through the Pacific. This is part of the reason why mainland China is investing in terrestrial trade routes through the Belt and Road Initiative and infrastructure projects. Chinese allies such as Myanmar and Cambodia, on the other hand, are very weak, and their naval incursions could lead other nations like the Philippines and Vietnam to go to the Taiwanese side. If China managed to overcome a disastrous amphibious landing, which would be incredibly difficult, they would probably have to deal with intense urban guerrilla warfare and a population that hates them. On top of that, the semiconductor industry might not be able to operate for several decades in the aftermath of such destruction. After all, most of the R&D is still located in the United States and Europe. The mainland also has a narrow time gap, is facing a shrinking population that will eventually have massive social and economic consequences for mainland China, unless they resort to mass immigration or get themselves out of it through automation. For this reason, I predict that Taiwan would probably stand its ground even in the event of a war. Keep in mind that much of what I'm saying is likely to be wrong given the coming years. It's really a waiting game to see what time tells us. Thanks for watching.